Hello and welcome to another Iceberg video, and thanks for the support in the previous one. In less than 2 months, y'all found a way to make this the second most viewed video on this channel, which indicates two things. One, I still have a lot of work to do if I want to get anywhere with this, and two, maybe I should consider leaning more towards Animal Crossing content moving forward. And I suppose, why not start here? Last time I talked about the worst, and now it's time to talk about the best Animal Crossing New Horizons villagers of every species. I fully expect this video to be a lot more contentious compared to the worst villagers. And the main reason why is because I'm not going to be like a lot of others and just base it off of who's the cutest one. At least not for all of them. I think the two main factors behind my favorites are, well, how much did I enjoy having this villager in one of my saves, since I had so many different saves back in New Leaf. And there's also going to be a focus on the aesthetic or theming behind certain villagers. So with all of that out of the way, let's get started with alligators. Not a lot of standouts within the species, but the best one is pretty easy for me. This villager immediately clicked with me the moment I had him in a New Leaf save. It is Sly. His desert camo color scheme is great, and it does well showcasing his overall theming alongside his catchphrase. The eye design is pretty cool as well, and it matches up with his energetic personality. Anteaters. I'm not sure if this pick is going to be subject to change, since there are a couple of other anteaters that are growing on me. I think I'll give some honorable mentions to Annabelle and Zoe, but in terms of the best anteater, I'm going to stick with Antonio. I think he was actually most memorable for me in Happy Home Designer, when he was asking for a room centered around minimalism. I think he fits pretty well with a more minimalist style due to his simple facial design. That being said, I really like how his tail and arms provide a more detailed contrast to that. Bears. Another fairly tough decision here. I was pretty close to going for the newest one, Megan, mostly because we haven't had a normal bear villager back in New Leaf. But the villager I've chosen is one that I've had in a couple of larger New Leaf towns, and at the time of recording, he's found his way back into my current island in quite possibly the best conclusion to a villager hunt that I've ever had. And that villager is Kurt. Kurt might just be my favorite cranky villager in this game. I love how his facial design makes him seem really approachable, and the partially grayscale color scheme fits very well with his design. Cranky villagers are supposed to represent a mature parental sort of personality, and to me, he's one of the best ones in that regard. Birds. I think I could give off some more honorable mentions with the birds. Now, I said before that there would be some hot takes here, but I'll give some honorable mentions to Jacques and Anchovy. Like Antonio, Jacques was most memorable for me in Happy Home Designer. I absolutely love his desire to be a DJ, and I personally find it pretty relatable. Check my music channel in the description to see what I mean. Anchovy, on the other hand, might be a bit derpy for some, but he was very memorable for me back in New Leaf, and he's returned to my current New Horizons island. But with all that being said, there's a villager that I've never had before that I think might provide more upside than anyone else, and that is Jay. I initially thought he was based off a blue jay, but I think he might be based on a swallow, given that big red spot on his face. I absolutely love his simple eye design, and his overall appearance fits so well with his personality. And coming from someone who's had Peck and Sparrow together back in New Leaf, it says something when this pick has more potential for me. Bulls. My main issue with this species is not that the worst bulls are really bad, which I don't think they are, but none of them are really anything special. For the best one, I've gone for the newest return, Stu. Yeah, this is one of those cases where if I had to pick someone, it's him. I've never had him before, but I think his blue color scheme makes him stand out. It's unusual, but it's also unique, and given that he wasn't in New Leaf initially, his return makes the species a little bit more interesting. Cats. I said before that the cats are a mixed bag for me, but there are some really great ones here. Bob, Rosie, and Tangy are some classics to the franchise, for example. In terms of proper honorable mentions, well, Punchy and Lolly have some pretty great designs, and even Kid Cat has grown on me quite a bit. But the best one is a pretty easy decision here. it's Mitzi. I had her pretty early on in New Leaf, and she seemed like one of the biggest standouts in her respective town. Her facial design is so cute, and the mix of blue and white is great. It fits well with her personality, and having its simple catchphrase that still finds a way to be related to Pokemon? That's the exclamation point for me. Chickens. I don't know what's a more controversial opinion, my least favorite chicken being Nox, or my favorite one being Goose. Look, the design is pretty simple, and I like clean and simple designs on most occasions. But that's not even the main reason why I like this guy. He was another villager that wound up being memorable for me in a larger New Leaf save. And he had a sort of western farmland aesthetic that I found to be very interesting despite his simple design. Cows. And while we're on the topic of farm aesthetics, this is one of those cases where theming can be crucial in terms of standing out. And in that regard, I've gone for Patty, centered around the catchphrase "How now, brown cow," and I think it's a pretty awesome concept. The color scheme is great, and the overall execution in and around her theming not only fit well with her peppy personality, but also made her stand out to me in terms of that western country-based style. Cubs. A lot of fantastic cub villagers. Their designs are generally pretty cute and simple. Well, maybe apart from Berold and Chester, but I could definitely include some honorable mentions here. Poncho and Bluebear were probably the most memorable cubs for me back in New Leaf, and I currently have Maple in my New Horizons save. Probably would have given her an honorable mention regardless. But just like with the birds, I'm going for someone who I've never had before. That being Pico. In terms of exotic villagers, Pico is very near the top for me. The eye design is excellent. The hairstyle and the pink touches, yeah, she's just an adorable villager all around. The white snout is fairly hard to notice, but for some reason I love it. Deer. Where do I even begin with the deer? One of, if not my absolute favorite species in the game, with almost all of them ranging from good to downright amazing. And for the best one, it was extremely close between two, Bo and Diana. Both of which have excellent designs and were very memorable for me when I had them. And really it came down to who was more memorable between the two, and for me that was Bo. This guy's one of the most easygoing lazy villagers I ever had in New Leaf. His eye design is just so humble and fits very well with his personality. And the blue finds a way to contrast well with his clean orange coat and his white snout. Another fairly simple design that works so amazingly well. Dogs. A massive honorable mention to Cookie. One of the best peppy villagers in the franchise, and it was a bit of a sad story with her in one of my saves. She was in the same New Leaf town as Bo and Goose, and she was actually the first villager from that town to move out. And the worst part? I couldn't even get a peppy villager to replace her. She's someone I would love to have again in New Horizons, but I have to give the slot to the first Sisterly villager I ever had, and in my opinion, easily the best Sisterly villager in the game, Cherry. When I had Cherry in my first town, what stood out the most for me was her modern, sort of gothic style. The mix in red or black matched with the darker interior just works so well. And she's another villager that is just extremely memorable for me. Ducks. There's a part of me that questions whether I'm overhyping the ducks. But at the same time, this species is home to a villager that might still be my all-time favorite in this franchise, and that villager is Bill. I'm not sure if I could put my finger on exactly why I love this villager, but I would say the all-around simple design is a pretty big factor, from the round eyes to the color scheme. Even before he wound up in what eventually became my largest New Leaf town, he seemed like such a standout for me. I think the best way to explain it is that it felt like I could tell exactly what sort of jock villager he was just by having him around. And at the time of recording, he's in my current New Horizons island, and I could not be more thrilled about it. Eagles. There's a lot of quality within the Eagles, and even then, I feel like there are some that don't get as much credit as they deserve. Take for example, Amelia. Amelia is someone that I think a lot of others tend to overlook, and I would make the argument that shouldn't be the case. I think I liked her more back when I had her in New Leaf with the spiderweb tee, but her facial design and color scheme are pretty great with the bold mix of red and white. Elephants. There are some incredible and very memorable highlights within the species, two of which were in my very first town, one of which was Dizzy, and the other one was Tia. Tia is such a sweet villager. I absolutely love how her design is centered around a teapot. She reminds me, and probably a lot of others, of Mrs. Potts from Beauty and the Beast. The detail in her design and theming makes her stand out so much for me, and it's part of what makes her one of my absolute favorite normal villagers in this game. Frogs. Like the cats, the frogs are a little too inconsistent for me. But there are still some pretty great highlights here. I think a lot of people would expect me to have either Henry or Lily as my favorite. They absolutely deserve an honorable mention, but for the best frog villager, I'm going to say Drift. Drift has one of the biggest and brightest smiles out there. I've never had him before, but his design just screams energetic. And it makes sense given that he's a jock villager. Plus, the color scheme's pretty unique and adds on to his energy even further. Goats. So there's one particular goat villager that seems to be getting a lot of attention. In my opinion, there are times where that attention isn't really deserved, but for the goats, yeah, I do agree that Sherb is the best one. Having a lazy goat villager in this game feels like a breath of fresh air. And I can definitely understand the hype around this guy. It's a fairly simple design matched up with an excellent shade of bright blue that's unnatural in the best way possible. Gorillas. This one was an easy decision. Even in a badly designed species, the theming behind this guy really pushes him up there as one of the better smug villagers in the game. I've gone for Hans. I love the concept of him being centered around a Yeti. The wintry color scheme is awesome, the white fur is actually brighter than his skin, and the aesthetic makes him stand out so much in comparison to the other gorillas. Hamsters. The hamsters were pretty close to making my bottom 7 of the worst species in the game, and that's mainly due to a lack of highlights. It just feels like most of them are kinda there. But I guess while we're on the topic of Arctic theming, let's talk about Flurry. It was close between a few hamsters, but I found Flurry to be the biggest standout, mostly aesthetic-wise. She's another villager that utilizes her wintry concept well. Maybe not as well as Hans, but it's still something to take note of. It's just a clean and cute design all around, and a great catchphrase that matches up well with it. Hippos. I mentioned in the last video that some hippos eventually soured on me, but there were also some that grew on me. And as a matter of fact, the best one is simply the one that's grown on me the most. And sure, the generic normal dialogue in New Horizons might be a factor, but I'm going to say Bertha. One thing that stood out to me about Bertha was that out of all of the villagers on her respective island, she seemed to be the most down to earth. Another example of how simplicity can sometimes work best, especially when it matches with her personality, and a lot of other villagers there were a bit more extravagant. Which is absolutely not a bad thing at all, but it's helped her provide a more approachable contrast for me. Horses. There's a common theme behind some of my favorite species. Memorability winds up being a big factor, and in some cases, it's because someone from those species landed in my very first New Leaf town and helped shape my experience with the franchise as a whole. For the elephants, it was Tia and Dizzy. For the ducks, it was Freckles, who's not even one of the best ones there, and that says something about the species as a whole. But for the horses, this guy was the first smug villager I had and might just be the best smug villager in the game. It is not Julian, it is Colton. To think that I wanted this guy to move out at one point, only for him to join Tia and Sherry in celebrating my birthday. That might just be his most memorable moments, especially given how I didn't really expect it. I love how his aesthetic is somewhat changed in New Horizons in a way that makes him seem more heroic. The story of a white knight and his steed, or in this case, a white steed. And the eye design is pretty amazing as well. Kangaroos. In terms of who's the best kangaroo villager, it's a really close battle. I'm talking Smash Bros. Melee, no items, Fox only, final destination type of battle between Astrid, Kit, Matilda, and Sylvia. But at the end of the day, I'm going to say Kit. Just as I mentioned with Bertha before, sometimes normal villagers work best with a simple, down-to-earth design. The eye design is pretty clean here, and the natural color scheme is great. Not the most memorable normal villager out there, but I guess I'll take what I can get. Koalas. Another fairly close contest between 2, and then eventually 3 koala villagers, but for now, I think it's Yuka. Another example of representing her personality well. Sure, the large nose may seem a bit wonky with the rest of her design, but everything else about her is pretty solid. And I like how the mix of navy and white matches up with her sort of mischievous eye design here. Lions. It's kind of funny how the best and worst lion villagers are the 2 villagers that made a more official return in New Horizons. One of which I've had in a previous New Horizons island, and well, I have to pick someone. I've gone for Rex. The safest design of the lions, and I think it's exactly what they're missing. The first thing that comes to mind when I think of this guy is the whole chill guy meme, which absolutely makes sense. And looking back, I think I made the wrong choice letting him go, given that he was then followed up by Owl and then Pudge. Yeah, I had to wait until the 3rd and current island to find a standout lazy villager in New Horizons here. Mice. When it came to the worst species, it was either due to a bunch of lowlights or a lack of highlights. And for the mice, it might be both. And it especially says something when the best of the species is probably the newest one, Petrie. I really like the lab scientist concept here. Certainly one of the better new arrivals to the franchise, and she's a breath of fresh air that this species needed. I like how the ears are different colors, and the eye design behind those glasses is actually really nice. Monkeys. I was pretty close to going for Tammy. She's an example of how to utilize the energetic side of peppy villagers, but then I actually had her on my island, and she wound up falling back a little bit. At the same time, there was another villager that I'd never had before that's starting to grow on me now. That villager is Deli. He's just caught my attention as of recently. Another example of simplicity that works so well for me. The sort of natural color scheme with the bright smile and the circular eye design, all of it makes him seem pretty approachable. Octopi. I said before that I don't really care for any of the octopus villagers, but again, I have to pick someone. I was close to going for Octavian, but I'm actually going for the newest one, Cephalobot. Clever name and an interesting design. I'm not usually the biggest fan of robot villagers, but the concept is executed fairly well here. He's had some chemistry with a couple of other villagers when I had him briefly in a previous New Horizons island. And even though I wound up replacing him with a villager from my first New Leaf town, and I don't really miss him all that much, I still think he's a decent villager. And his interior is great. Ostriches. A lot of underrated ostriches, and I'm guessing Phoebe is probably the most popular of the bunch, mainly due to her unique theming being based around a phoenix. I have her in my current New Horizons save, and I was very close to going for her, but I felt like that would be a bit too predictable. I'm instead going for a newer return that might just be a bit more overlooked in comparison, and that's Julia. Let's first talk about the change from a peppy to a snooty villager, because I did not expect it to work so well here. And the peacock-based design is excellent. For some reason, she kind of reminds me of Maisie from Seussical. Flamboyant in her design, but willing to help when it matters most due to that change of personality. Penguins. I really like the penguin villagers, and I would say the standouts are pretty clear-cut for me. Aurora and Road have some really clean designs. Igly was quite memorable for me in New Horizons, but I don't think anybody can represent the penguin villagers any better than Sprinkle. If you want some winter-based villagers, this should be one of the first ones to look out for. The bright blue touches are fantastic with her design, where one of the first things that comes to mind for me is Frozen, which absolutely adds up. Pigs. An easy decision for me, and apparently not a popular one. I said before that these picks are personal and often based on memorability. And as for the best one here, I've gone for Lucy. One of the starters from my largest New Leaf town, and one of only 2 villagers that has stuck around pretty much the entire way through. Simply the most memorable of the pigs, and arguably the most underrated as well. And her aesthetic has become a bit more haunting in New Horizons, which I find pretty fascinating. At the very least, she pulls it off better than Coco does. Oh, and speaking of Coco, rabbits. If only the rabbits were a little more consistent for me. The highlights are pretty great, and there are a lot of firsts within this species. Gabby was the first campsite villager I had in New Leaf, and I would absolutely take her over Twiggy. Cole was the first villager to ever move out from one of my saves. Francine was the first rabbit villager I had in New Horizons, which isn't even that special since I did have her in a New Leaf save before. And even though all 3 of these rabbits are great, I have to go for the first shock villager I had in this franchise, and that is Snake. As I mentioned earlier, most of the villagers I had in my first town helped shape my experience with the franchise and gave me a pretty welcoming perspective behind each personality. Snake was that for the Jock villagers, providing some energy every single time I talked with him. Another case that comes down to which one I had the most memorable experience with. Rhinos. This one doesn't even need an introduction, it has to be Meringue. The theming is so obvious yet so brilliant at the same time. This is a villager based around a strawberry shortcake, with the white hair representing the icing and the horn representing the strawberry itself. This is one of the best food-based villagers out there. Sheep. I mentioned before that a villager's aesthetic can be an important factor in standing out, especially in a species that really needs to stand out. Just like with Meringue, sometimes a unique theming can help make a villager catch my attention. No, I'm not talking about Pietro, I'm talking about Frida. Without a doubt, one of the most underrated sisterly villagers in the game, with her design being centered around fast food in so many different ways. From hot dogs to burgers to french fries, and it still keeps going once you notice her house interior. Another excellent food-based concept executed so well. Squirrels. The highlights are pretty fantastic, and it says something when Marshall barely makes my top 5 in this species. A lot of people seem to be pretty obsessed with this guy, but my personal favorite squirrel villager is Filberts. A villager who I thought was pretty cute back in New Leaf, but New Horizons found a way to make him even cuter. I love how in New Horizons, the voice of a villager is not just determined by personality, but also by its species. Larger ones have deeper voices, and smaller ones like the squirrels have squeakier ones. And I think that's helped Filbert more than anybody else here. The bright blue and the facial design mixed in with that squeakier voice makes him seem a lot more youthful. The pieces just fit perfectly for him in New Horizons, even more than it did back in New Leaf. Tigers. The last of the best species, and if you saw my previous video, you should have seen this coming. Sure, the highlights might not be as strong as the squirrels or the horses, but even the worst of the tigers is probably the best one out of anyone in that video. And in terms of the best tiger, although I've had Claudia in my first New Leaf town, I'm going to say Rolf. One of the best cranky villagers I had back in New Leaf, where the facial design matches up with his personality very well. The angry unibrow fits but doesn't go over the top for me, and the gray stripes are a really nice touch. And finally, the wolves. I actually didn't care for the wolves that much back in New Leaf, but as a whole, they've been growing on me in New Horizons, and I think Audie might be one of the main reasons why. When I first saw her in my New Horizons save, my first thought was, why is there a peppy wolf villager in this game now? But over time, I started to understand the hype. With the shades, she absolutely rocks that pop star look, and she's got a great color scheme and a great story behind this concept. I don't say this often about the new arrivals, but this is a villager that deserves her acclaim. And that will wrap up this video. Let me know of your favorites in the comments below. And if you guys enjoyed, feel free to like this video and subscribe to the channel. And I'll talk to you in the next video.